Elena had 73 years and 30 acres of woodland when her oldest son looked at her one last time before closing the door of the apartment in New York City and said, with the voice of someone explaining something obvious to a child who doesn't understand, "Mom, it's just forest, it doesn't even have road access. 30 acres of dense wilderness in the Appalachian foothills of Virginia. No paved road, no electricity, no running water, no neighbors, no value." That was the verdict from the two men who had divided between themselves the apartment and the investment accounts, while their mother signed the document with a hand that trembled, not from fear, but from holding everything she could not say in that moment. 73 years, 46 years of marriage to George, 46 years of cooking, of his trips she never fully understood, of silences in the middle of the night when he came home smelling of damp earth and fresh sawdust, and she pretended to sleep but lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering what that man was looking for in those woods every single weekend. Now she knew. After 20 minutes on a trail into a forest her sons had never once bothered to set foot in, Elena stopped in the middle of the path and stood there, unable to breathe. A house, a whole house, hidden inside the forest like a secret kept for decades, with wooden walls that gleamed even in the shade of the old-growth oaks, with windows George had placed facing east so the first light of the day would come straight into the living room. 1,700 square feet of hardwood, a solar energy system, a rainwater collection system, a flourishing vegetable garden, a loaded fruit orchard, a library with 3,000 books, and inside it, in a blue folder on George's desk, a letter that began, "Elena, I built this house 1 room per year. Every wall holds a story of ours." And that's when she understood. The sons kept the concrete. She kept the forest. And inside that forest, catalogued by a forestry engineer who spent 25 years building a gift his wife could only open after he was gone, there were 12 native species at risk of extinction, species that made that land eligible for a federal conservation program that paid $55,000 a year. A public university had already submitted a formal proposal of $27,000 annually to use the property as a field research station. And the reforestation timber George had planted over 3 decades, white oaks, tulip poplars, American chestnuts, had reached the precise point of sustainable management and was worth $1.1 million in carbon credits, $1.1 million in woodland that the sons hadn't even wanted to go see. But what Edward and Marcus didn't know, what neither of them could have imagined in that moment when they looked at their 73-year-old mother and saw only a weight to be divided, is that George knew exactly what his sons would do, and he spent 25 years preparing for that day. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, it's never too late. Subscribe now and stay until the end, because what Elena found at the heart of that forest will make you believe that true love never disappears. It only waits for the right moment to be found. Elena Kristina Resende-Bachovich was born on March 14, 1951, in a wooden house on Maple Street in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, an autumn morning when the Blue Ridge Mountains were wrapped in fog and the old oak trees in her grandmother Eunice's yard were dripping dew onto the fern beds below. She was the 3rd daughter of her father Aurelio, who worked at the Martinsburg Farmers Market loading sacks of grain and vegetables, and of her mother Eunice, who took in sewing, raised chickens in the back of the yard, and made a slow-cooked pot roast in a clay Dutch oven that was famous throughout the whole street. Harper's Ferry in the 1950s was a town that seemed to have stopped time at the turn of the century. Cobblestone streets sloped down toward the Shenandoah River, which ran gently through the center of town, with a color like herbal tea, and sometimes overflowed in winter and flooded the lower houses. The people complained, but nobody moved, because that river was part of everything. The smell of the town, the sound of the town, the memory of the town. The train station still operated in those days, and Elena remembered standing at the window of the room she shared with her sisters Rosie and Vera, waiting for the whistle of the 6 o'clock evening train, which she could hear rising up the hillside long before it appeared around the bend, trailing white steam through the oak trees. Elena's childhood was poor with dignity, the kind of poverty that is only recognized as such later, after you've grown up. Back then, it was simply life. It was waking at 5 in the morning to the smell of coffee her mother put on the wood-burning stove. It was going to school in rubber boots in winter because dress shoes were saved for important occasions. It was doing homework in the corner of the kitchen table while her mother sewed and her father ate dinner in silence after a full day at the market. It was not having much of anything, but not feeling like anything was missing either, because her sisters were noisy and the yard was large. And Grandma Eunice lived 3 houses down and always had an apple or an orange to spare. What Elena inherited from that childhood wasn't material, but it was solid as stone. The ability to do much with little, the conviction that a home is held together by work and not by words, and a patience her sisters called calm, but which was really the ability to swallow what needed to be swallowed and wait for the right moment to speak. Grandma Eunice used to say that Elena had the blood of an oak tree. She grew slowly, spread wide, and came down when the time came. It was a compliment Elena only understood decades later. In school, she was a good student without being brilliant, the kind of student teachers appreciate without remembering much afterward. She learned to read with ease and spent her entire life as a voracious reader, which in Harper's Ferry in the 1960s meant reading her father's newspaper, her mother's paperback novels, and the old-school textbooks the library lent out, which she read cover to cover, including the parts that weren't for her grade level. There was a town library with 300 volumes in a room next to the post office, and Elena went there alone for the first time at age 11 and came out with 3 books under her arm and a feeling in her chest that she would describe many years later to George as the feeling of having discovered a place that exists only for me. George Antonio Bachovich entered Elena's life in a way she never considered dramatic or romantic, but which she came to understand over time was perfect exactly as it was. It was the summer of 1971. Elena was 20 years old and working as a cashier at Domindo's Pharmacy on Main Street, where she was on duty from 8 to 6, Monday through Saturday, counting out medications, labeling bottles, and helping the ladies of the town who came looking for blood pressure pills and vitamins for their children. George walked in one Thursday asking for an antifungal for a rash he'd picked up in the woods. He was finishing his degree in forestry at Virginia Tech and spent weekends in the Appalachian foothills doing field research, staying at an aunt's house on the east side of town. He was 24 years old, tall, lean, with large hands that spoke of someone who worked outdoors, and he talked about forests with a seriousness Elena found simultaneously funny and absolutely genuine. When she went to the back room to find the medication, he stood at the counter looking at the shelves and said, without her having asked anything, "There's an old oak tree outside this window. Do you know an oak like that takes 80 years to get that size?" Elena came back with the medication, looked at the window, looked at him, and said, "I know. I grew up watching it." George came back the following week without any rash, asking for something for a scratch. He came back the week after that with a list of vitamins he had written himself on a piece of notebook paper. By the 3rd week, he simply walked in, went straight to the counter and said, "I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to have coffee with me after your shift. There's a bakery nearby that makes very good apple pie." Elena's mother, Eunice, said she shouldn't go alone. Grandma Eunice said she should go running. Elena went. The courtship lasted 2 years, from Blacksburg to Harper's Ferry, from handwritten letters Elena kept in a shoebox under her bed, to weekends when George arrived by bus and Elena was there waiting with that oak tree patience of hers, and conversations that lasted until midnight on the porch of her parents' house, while her father pointedly coughed from inside to signal it was late enough. George talked about forests, about species, about how the American woodland had been devastated, and how it was possible to recover at least part of what had been destroyed. Elena listened and asked questions, not out of politeness, but because she genuinely wanted to understand. And George always said it was that which conquered him. Most people pretended interest when he talked about his work, but Elena actually cared. They married in March of 1973 in a simple ceremony at the First Methodist Church of Harper's Ferry, with fewer than 50 guests, a lunch of smoked brisket that Grandma Eunice made, and a wedding cake Elena's mother prepared with 5 eggs and a great deal of condensed milk. George wore the only suit he owned, grey, a little loose at the shoulders. Elena wore a white dress her mother had sewn over 3 months, with lace at the collar and satin-covered buttons down the back. The photos came out slightly blurry because the photographer was her father's brother-in-law, but Elena kept them all and put them in a burgundy album that sat on the living room bookshelf for decades. The first years were in New York City, where George found employment with a reforestation company working with the federal government on the replanting of degraded zones in the Appalachian Corridor and the Mid-Atlantic Highlands. They lived in a two-bedroom apartment in Queens, modest, with windows looking onto a neighboring wall and a kitchen barely larger than a hallway, but which Elena transformed into a pleasant place with plants on the windowsill and a floral tablecloth her mother had given her as a wedding gift. Elena found work as an administrative assistant at a dental clinic near home, where she spent 6 years learning to organize files, draft correspondence, and manage a schedule with the quiet efficiency that was her hallmark in everything she did. Edward was born in 1975, 2 years after the wedding, and Marcus in 1978. Elena left work when Edward was born and didn't return to formal employment, because George earned enough for the family and because, she said, raising 2 active boys in a 2-bedroom apartment was already enough work. But the fuller truth was that Elena had been raised in a home where the mother was always present, at breakfast, at school pickup, at dinner. That was the model of the world she carried with her. She carried it without questioning it and without regret, but also without ever having asked herself if it was truly what she wanted, a question many women of her generation never asked themselves. Edward was the oldest and the most difficult. From a young age he showed an impatience with the world that his mother attributed to intelligence and his father to lack of discipline, and both were half right. He was clever, he had a good memory and learned quickly, but he used that to argue against anything that contradicted what he wanted. And by age 10, he was already negotiating his own punishments with a skill that left Elena simultaneously irritated and secretly impressed. He grew up to be a lawyer, which George said without irony was the most natural choice in the world. Marcus was different, quieter, easier day to day, but with a quality Elena took years to name correctly and which she finally identified as indifference. It wasn't cruelty, it never was. It was a genuine ability to not care much about anything that didn't directly affect his own life. And that included his mother, his father, family problems, the stories she told. He listened with a neutral face and responded with the minimum number of words necessary. He became a financial analyst, which George also said was the most natural choice in the world. And the two brothers together formed a combination that, seen from outside, appeared complementary, but which in practice meant that any decision involving the two of them was made by Edward with Marcus's silent approval. Elena was never naive about the character of her sons. She knew them with the brutal intimacy that only a mother possesses, knew their blind spots, their ambitions, their fears disguised as coldness. But she loved with the kind of love that doesn't need reciprocity to sustain itself, which is the most painful love that exists, because it never goes out even when it should. George over the years advanced in his career in ways Elena followed with genuine pride but partial understanding. He moved from private practice to the U.S., Forest Service, then to federal conservation programs in the Appalachian Corridor, then to independent consulting that took him to survey forests in Virginia and West Virginia, cataloging species, evaluating properties, drafting management plans. He earned well, not exceptionally well, but enough for them to buy a 3-bedroom apartment in the Upper West Side in the 1990s, send both sons to private schools, and take 1 trip a year to the mountains, which almost invariably meant the Shenandoah Valley or back to Harper's Ferry, because George said there was nowhere in the world with the same quality of light as the Appalachian foothills in winter, when the fog came down and hung suspended over the rivers, and everything turned the same shade of silver. The Upper West Side apartment had 2,400 square feet, a bookshelf in the living room, and a kitchen with a central island that Elena used for Sunday lunches, which were the family's fixed ritual until the sons married. Sunday lunch with roast chicken or slow-cooked ribs or a proper pot roast depending on the season, with rice, beans cooked from scratch, and a good homemade salsa, never from a jar, because Eunice had taught that canned beans were for people who didn't respect themselves, and Elena carried that lesson as law until the end. She would describe the Upper West Side years, if she described them, as the life that worked. It was not a life of great passions or great dramas. It was a life of good routine. George left at 7:30. She had her coffee and read the newspaper. Then she organized the house, not because it needed it, but because liking the house orderly was the same as liking clean air, a need she couldn't even name. On Tuesdays, she had a quilting class that she attended for 22 years in a group of neighborhood women, where the topic was always the same: grandchildren, children, health, soap operas, and where Elena was always the quietest, but also the most punctual, and the one with the most careful work. On Thursdays, the library. On Saturdays, the farmer's market on Columbus Avenue, where she bought vegetables and chatted with Mr. Angelo, who had the fruit stand and knew the name of every customer for decades. George, in those years, made frequent work trips, weekends in the mountains, sometimes a whole week away, sometimes two. Elena never questioned it much, because it was his work, and his work had always been like that. But there were details she noticed and stored without knowing quite what to do with them. The work pants that came home, not with mud, but with sawdust. The rolls of film he dropped off at the pharmacy, for developing and picked up in a sealed envelope without showing her. The time Edward, passing through his father's study, asked what that blueprint was spread out on the desk, and George closed the folder before his son could read it, and said with a casualness that seemed slightly rehearsed, "Work stuff, son. Boring stuff." The toolbox that travelled with him sometimes, hammer, chisel, level, which struck Elena as strange for an engineer who she assumed did desk and field work, not construction. One July night in 2004, Elena woke at 3 in the morning to an empty bed and found George sitting on the apartment terrace with a glass of whiskey, staring at nothing, something he rarely did. She sat beside him without speaking, and he stayed a long while looking at the city lights before saying, "When I'm gone, don't let them sell the forest." Elena asked, "What forest?" He said, "The forest I'm tending." She wanted to ask more, but something in his voice, not sadness, something closer to fullness, like a man who has finished a long calculation and is satisfied with the result, made her stay quiet. She never forgot that night. Physically, Elena was a woman of calm presence, neither tall nor short, with hair that turned white at 55, which she never wanted to dye because she liked the white, felt it suited her. Her hands were the hands of someone who had worked her whole life, without that appearing as bitterness. Short, strong fingers, nails always trimmed, no rings except the wedding band, which she had worn on the correct finger for 40 years. Her eyes were dark brown, serious, with the quality of someone who truly sees what is in front of them, not what they want to see, not what is convenient, but what is actually there. George used to say it was impossible to lie to Elena because she listened with her eyes, and that her eyes were like a ruler that measured everything. She had a habit that everyone who knew her well always mentioned. When she was thinking about something important, she rubbed her thumb against her wedding band, not nervously, but as if verifying it was still there, the way someone consults an instrument before making a decision. The sons found the tick irritating. George found it the most beautiful thing in the world. Of happy moments there were many, but there were two that Elena carried with a clarity distinct from all other memories, with that sharpness that only the most important moments possess, where, when you relive them, you feel the smell, the temperature of the air, the weight of your own body in that exact instant. The first was Christmas of 1993, when Edward was 18 and Marcus 15, and the family was still whole and still fit around the kitchen table in the apartment. George had come back from his last trip with a bottle of small-batch bourbon from Tennessee and a bag of wild foraged fruit, pawpaws, persimmons, service berries, and placed them in a bowl at the center of the table as if they were the most precious things in the world. That night had the rare quality of nights when nobody is in a hurry to leave, when conversations go long and laughter comes easily, and time seems to have suspended itself out of special consideration. George told field stories. Edward and Marcus fought over a video game, and Elena laughed until she cried at the seriousness of the argument. And at the end of the night, when the boys had gone to bed and she and George were washing dishes together, he said in the voice of someone speaking of something larger than it appears, "This is the best Christmas I've ever had." The second was a morning in August of 2016, 4 years before George's death, when they woke early for no reason and walked to the corner bakery and drank coffee sitting on the stoop. with the winter sun hitting them from the side and the dry cold of the city making the coffee all the more necessary. Nothing special happened. George talked about a new project. Elena talked about a book she was reading. A stray dog walked by and stopped in front of them waiting for a piece of pastry. They gave it one and the dog left without a thank you. And in that ordinary morning, sitting on a white plastic chair on a New York City stoop, Elena felt something she couldn't name in the moment and took months to identify. The feeling that everything was fine, not in any dramatic or philosophical sense, but in the simplest sense possible. Everything is fine right now, in this exact instant, and this exact instant is enough. George died in November of 2020 from a massive heart attack during a field trip in the Virginia mountains. He was 73 years old, alone on a dirt road between Harper's Ferry and Charlottesville, when his heart stopped and he was found by a farmer passing on a motorcycle who called emergency services. Elena was home on a Wednesday afternoon watering the terrace plants when the phone rang. She stood still, the watering can in her hand, for a time she couldn't measure. Then she set it down on the floor with great care, as if it were fragile, and went to sit in the living room armchair. And she sat in that armchair until Edward arrived at 7 in the evening. George Antonio Batchovich's wake was on Thursday at a funeral home on the Upper East Side, with fewer people than Elena expected and more than her sons had planned. Colleagues from the Forest Service arrived. Roger Narayan, who had been George's supervisor, came with red eyes and stood for a long while looking at the casket without being able to say anything. Dr. Martha Saito from NYU, his research partner for 20 years, brought a bouquet of wildflowers, which Elena found the most beautiful gift imaginable. Two younger researchers Elena didn't know stayed in a corner speaking quietly in the tone of people who go on discussing work even at a wake, which is the way certain people show respect. Neighborhood friends, acquaintances from the quilting group, the daughter of old Mr. Angelo, because Mr. Angelo had died a year earlier, and his daughter came in his name. Edward and Marcus were there naturally, each with his wife. Fernanda, Edward's wife, 44, a lawyer like her husband, with that way of holding her glass by the fingertips as if the whole world were unclean. Patricia, Marcus's wife, 41, who checked her phone every 15 minutes with a discretion that was no discretion at all. The grandchildren were home with babysitters. Elena said nothing about that, but she noted it, and the notation stayed inside her like a splinter of wood under the skin, small but present. In the days immediately following George's death, Edward and Marcus came to their mother's home with a frequency that Elena, in the first dazed days of grief, mistook for genuine affection. Edward came every day, sometimes twice. Marcus called in the morning and appeared in the afternoon. They brought food, ran errands, handled what needed handling. Elena let them in and sat in the living room armchair, the same one where she had been sitting the afternoon of the phone call, and received the movement around her like someone at the center of a whirlpool who cannot feel the current. It was in the second week that Edward sat down in the chair across from her armchair with a manila envelope and said, in that tone of patient explanation Elena had recognized since he was a teenager, "Mom, we need to talk about the documents." There was a will. George had left a will with a notary in 2016, the same year as the morning coffee on the stoop. Elena noticed, and the coincidence pressed on her heart in a way she couldn't explain. The will was simple in structure. The Upper West Side apartment and the financial investments, which amounted, according to Edward, to a total of $170,000 after market adjustments, went to both sons in equal parts. For Elena, there remained a parcel of native woodland in the county of Augusta, Virginia, registered under deed number 47222 in the county land registry, with a total surface area of 30 acres. Edward placed the envelope on the coffee table between them and looked at her with an expression that tried to be gentle and didn't quite manage it. "We read the documents," he said. "The land is a protected natural area. You can't build on it. You can't subdivide it. It barely has access. There's a trail but no road. We looked it up on Google Maps and it's dense forest. It has no market value. Mum, Dad left this to you." "He left it," Edward confirmed. "But we wanted you to know it isn't a practical gift. We can look into ways to compensate you. If you'd like to stay with one of us while we decide—" "I'm not going to stay with anyone," said Elena. There was a silence. Marcus, who had been standing by the window through the entire conversation, looked up from his phone toward his mother for the first and only time. "Mom, you don't have to leave right now. But the apartment will need to be transferred to our names, because that's what the will says. We'll give you a few months." "A few months?" repeated Elena. "It's reasonable," said Fernanda from the kitchen doorway where she had been listening, and Edward glanced at his wife with that micro-movement of the eyebrow that means didn't need to say that, but said nothing. That night, after the sons left, Elena sat in the living room armchair for a long time, looking at the walls of the apartment. She looked at the bookshelf, at George's books on the left side, dense, technical, some with pressed leaves between the pages as improvised bookmarks. She looked at the watercolor painting of Harper's Ferry above the sofa, which George had bought from a local artist when they were still dating. She looked at the terrace plants that would need watering tomorrow. She rubbed her thumb against the wedding band. What followed in the 3 months that came next, Elena never described in detail to anyone, not to Roger from the Forest Service, not to the quilting friends, not later to the people who came to form part of her new life. But there are fragments she let escape at different moments, which together form a portrait that needs no great completeness to be understood. There was the morning she woke at 4 in the morning hearing footsteps in the apartment and took a second to remember it was impossible, because George was dead. And that second of forgetting was followed by a kind of pain she described once as falling from a height, without having climbed. There was the afternoon Fernanda appeared with an interior designer, and the two of them walked through the apartment measuring walls with a tape measure that snapped at the ends, and Elena was in the kitchen making coffee and heard the numbers called out loud. "This wall is 14 feet. The terrace is 10 feet deep. This floor will need to come up," while she stood holding a cup she hadn't yet filled. There was the last Saturday she went to the farmer's market on Columbus Avenue, and Mr. Angelo's daughter spotted her and came running and asked how she was doing, and Elena said, "Fine, thank you," with a smile she knew hadn't reached her eyes, and the daughter held her hand a moment before letting go. And that small gesture, so common, so completely unnecessary, made Elena cross half the block before she could stop and breathe without crying. There was the night Edward called to confirm the move-out date and said, as if it were a kindness she should be grateful for, "We set aside Dad's things for you to take. The rest stays because we'll be using it." Elena asked which things were her father's. Edward said, "Whatever books you want, the photos, the clothes. We need to keep the tools." She didn't ask why the tools were worth more than the mother, because the answer wasn't going to change anything, and Elena was a woman who didn't ask questions, whose answers wouldn't change anything. There was a rainy August night, the fine rain tapping the window of the bedroom where she still slept on her side after 50 years of habit. When she opened the drawer of George's nightstand, which the sons hadn't touched because it was a small drawer, and nothing there seemed to have value, and inside she found 3 things: a photo of herself, alone on a beach she didn't remember, young and laughing towards someone outside the frame, a slip of paper with 5 words in George's small handwriting that said, "You will never be alone," and a smaller manila envelope inside the land deed envelope, with a note on the outside that said, "Open it only when you're there." Elena held the envelope in her hand for a long time. Then she put it back in the drawer, closed it, and spent the following weeks knowing there was something in that envelope that was going to change something, without having the courage to open it or the heart to throw it away. The day of the move was a Thursday in September, 3 months and 2 days after the conversation with Edward. Elena had 1 large blue suitcase, the same one they used for family trips, and 2 cardboard boxes with the books she'd chosen, the photographs, the burgundy wedding album, her mother's floral tablecloth, the Harper's Ferry watercolor, and some other things that fit. The rest stayed. The terrace plants stayed because Fernanda said they'd be well taken care of, which Elena was almost certain was untrue, but wasn't argument enough to make a scene. Edward was there when she left, with the posture of a man who had mentally prepared for the situation and was convinced he was handling it correctly. He hugged his mother at the door. A hug that lasted exactly the right amount of time, not so short as to seem indifferent, not so long as to feel felt. "If you need anything, Mum," he said. Elena didn't respond because there was no adequate response to that. She rode the elevator down with the large suitcase and the 2 boxes in 2 trips, alone, because the doorman had called in sick that day and she piled everything on the sidewalk. The cab she called took 4 minutes to arrive. It was 11:20 in the morning on a Thursday in September, and the New York City sky was that September sky of the eastern seaboard, white and direct, without the softness of winter sun or the brutality of summer sun. Just presence, just light without temperature yet defined. Elena stood on the sidewalk waiting for the cab, looking up at the apartment. 8th floor. Windows she had washed for 30 years every last Friday of the month. The terrace plants were there, green. The Harper's Ferry watercolor was no longer there. She had taken it. She had $530 in her account, plus George's pension from the Forest Service that would begin soon, amount still uncertain, somewhere in the paperwork. She was 73 years old. 1 blue suitcase, 2 cardboard boxes, 30 acres of dense woodland in the Virginia mountains. And an envelope she still hadn't opened. The cab arrived. She loaded the boxes. The driver helped with the suitcase without being asked, and she said thank you in a firm voice, because a firm voice was what she had. Elena spent the following week in a modest hotel in downtown Staunton, Virginia, the Hotel 24 South, 100 yards from the historic district, with a clean room and breakfast included, and a view of the old courthouse that she sat watching through the window in the mornings while drinking coffee. She spent $660 over 6 days, not because she needed 6 days, but because she couldn't go to the property without someone who knew the way, and it took time to find that person. That person was Roger Narayan, George's former supervisor at the Forest Service, who answered when she called and said without hesitation, "Miss Elena, I know where it is. I went there with him once. Let me arrange a day and I'll take you." Roger was 62 with white hair, a few days' beard, an old truck that smelled of diesel and dry mud, the smell of someone who spends their life outdoors. They met one Thursday morning in front of the Staunton courthouse at 7:30, with the sun still low and the fog descending the Blue Ridge in slow bands over the forest. On the drive to the access point, Roger spoke little, which was his way, but what little he said was enough. He said George had been the best species cataloger he'd ever known. Not the fastest, not the most published, the best, which is different. He said that in the last field trips, George sometimes disappeared for a day or 2 and came back with photos and samples that Roger never quite understood where they'd been collected. He said the last time they'd gone to the property together, about 2 years before George's death, he'd noticed something he couldn't identify at the time, but now recognized as satisfaction. The look of a man who sees something and thinks, "It's ready." "Ready for what?" asked Elena. "Ready," said Roger simply. "I don't know for what, but ready." They stopped the truck on a dirt path that branched from the state highway, marked only by an old wooden post with no sign. Roger was first to step down and extended his hand to Elena, who got down alone without needing the hand, but accepted the gesture, because it was a gesture of respect, not pity, and she knew the difference. The trail entered the dense forest immediately. 10 steps in, the road disappeared behind them. 20 steps in, the sound of traffic vanished. Elena walked behind Roger without speaking, feeling the ground change beneath her feet. From dirt to leaves, from leaves to roots, from roots to a soft, moist soil that absorbed each step without sound. The forest was dense, not in an oppressive sense, but in a living one, everything growing over everything. Enormous ferns carpeting the ground in irregular patterns, wild orchids growing directly on the trunks of trees as if they had chosen their spots with care. There were invisible birds making sounds she couldn't name. There was the smell of wet earth mixed with something that took her a few more steps to identify as pine resin. A white oak above releasing sap into the morning sun as it filtered through the gaps between branches. Elena walked with the quiet ache in her right knee she'd had since age 65, her suitcase left at the hotel with the boxes, carrying only a small backpack with water, a turkey sandwich, and the envelope she had finally removed from George's nightstand drawer and placed in the outer pocket of the backpack before leaving the room, thinking, If there's a right place to open this, it's there. 17 minutes after entering the trail, Roger stopped. He turned toward Elena, who was coming up behind him. "Are you ready?" he asked. Elena looked ahead, where the trail made a gentle curve between two old oak trunks that had grown side by side until they nearly touched at the top, forming a natural arch. Beyond the curve, she still couldn't see. She rubbed her thumb against the wedding band. "Yes," she said. And they rounded the curve. If you followed Elena's story this far, if you felt in your chest the weight she carried through all those months, I ask you to leave your like on this video and subscribe to the channel Never Too Late. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single story, and comment below where you're watching from. What city? What state? Because knowing there are people on the other side of the screen walking alongside her makes all the difference. Now, what did Elena find when she rounded that curve in the forest? It changes everything. What Elena saw when she rounded the curve was, at first, only more forest, and then her eyes adjusted and she saw the house. How long had it been there? 25 years of construction, 40, perhaps, of planning inside George's mind. And the forest had grown around it with the gentleness that nature sometimes shows toward things that deserve to be protected. It wasn't hidden in the sense that someone had deliberately concealed it. It was hidden in the sense that the forest had grown alongside it, with it, as if accepting that this was its place. The old fig trees on the eastern side, with roots that traced the foundation without invading it. The oaks forming a canopy of branches above the roof that filtered the sunlight into patterns that shifted throughout the day. Wild bromeliads settled in the corners where the roof met the walls, like ornaments no one had placed, but that were perfect. The house was L-shaped, with the main body facing north and a smaller wing facing east. The walls were dark, honey-colored wood. Black walnut, Elena would learn later, cut and dried by George from the reforestation groves of the region, with carpentry joints that required no nails in many places, just wood fitting into wood, with a precision that comes only from many years of practice. The roof was dark colonial tile, with a generous slope that kept rain away from the walls, and on the roof, in the corner that received the most sun, there were 2 solar panels on an iron mount George had welded himself, painted green to blend with the landscape. The windows were wood with interior shutters, 4 on the main facade, 2 on the wing, each with a wooden box beneath the sill, where wild ferns had sprouted in green cascades, reaching half a meter down. The entrance door was solid black walnut, with cast-iron hinges and a matching latch, and it had carved into the upper section a pattern of oak leaves that was only visible when you got close enough to see the details. Elena stood before the door longer than Roger expected. He stood 3 steps back, giving space, shoulders slightly curved inward, in the way of someone who is present but doesn't want to take up too much room. The door was closed, but not locked. The latch yielded to the pressure of her hand, and when Elena pushed it, the wood opened with the sound of well-fitted wood, completely different from the sound of old wood dragging. It was a clean click, a brief resistance, and then a soft giving way. A door built to last and maintained in the condition of lasting. The smell that came out first was wood, dry, clean wood, with a faint base of linseed oil used to treat and preserve. And beneath that deeper, a smell of earth and resin and vegetation that came through the ventilation gaps and made that interior space smell simultaneously like careful construction and like the living forest outside, as if the house were not a refuge from the forest, but an extension of it, a place where the forest had agreed to become interior. The entry was a short corridor of about 6 feet that opened into a main living room. Elena stood in the doorway and looked. The room was 20 feet by 26, with 11-foot ceilings that made the space seem much larger than the dimensions suggested. The walls were wood in vertical planks, the same dark honey walnut from outside, and the floor was also wood. Yellow cedar laid in herringbone pattern, smooth and matte with use but whole and flawless. On the north side there were 3 large windows, the same ones with shutters and the ferns, and the light coming through them was that forest light that is not direct but diffuse, as if the trees outside functioned as a giant softening filter for everything that passed through. Along the window wall stood a long, rustic wooden table with 4 simple chairs, functional with raw leather seats that were dry but intact. In the center of the table sat a ceramic pot with a lid that Roger would later identify as a handmade piece by a local craftsman. Inside it, among other things Elena would discover later, was a handwritten list of instructions for maintaining the house's systems. On the opposite wall, a floor-to-ceiling built-in shelf, built in place, in wood, joined into the structure of the wall itself, with books organized in the order Elena recognized immediately as George's order, by subject, within the subject by author, within the author by date: tropical botany, silviculture, forest ecology, environmental cartography, environmental law, natural history of the United States. Entire rows of technical volumes with colored spines, interspersed here and there with novels and poetry books she recognized as George's favorites, the ones he reread: Thoreau, Mary Oliver, an old edition of The Old Man and the Sea. With a spine so broken it looked like it had been read 30 times, which it probably had, and in the left corner of the shelf, at Eleanor's eye level, was a row of photo albums. She counted 11 albums bound in brown leather, numbered on the spine in pencil. She took number 1. The first photos were of the land, open vegetation, a space that looked carefully cleared, a circular opening in the middle of the forest with direct sunlight hitting it. The date printed below the photos was 1995. Elena stared at the year. 1995. Edward was 20. Marcus was 17. George had begun in 1995. She put the album back in its place and continued. The kitchen was at the back of the living room in an open continuation. No wall separated them. Only the change of floor from wood planks to rustic terracotta tile in an ochre color that must have been carried to the property by George in parts over the years. The kitchen had a stone countertop, not industrial, with a slightly rough surface and the characteristic grey-green color, and wooden wall cabinets with louvered doors that let air circulate. There was a simple sink with a metal faucet connected to the rainwater collection system. There was a gas stove with a tank beneath the counter. There was a small refrigerator, the cream color of old appliances, connected to the solar system. The refrigerator was off. Naturally, no one had turned it on, but clean. The counter was clean. The cabinets, when Elena opened one, revealed pantry shelves: rice in sealed glass jars, beans in sealed glass jars, salt, sugar, coffee, oil, a row of home preserves in glass jars with metal lids, and handwritten labels identifying the contents and date. The most recent label said, "Pickled Ramps, July 2019, 16 months before George's death." He had been here 16 months before he died. Roger, who had come in behind Elena and moved through the house quietly, with the care of someone who knows they're in a place that isn't theirs, stopped in front of the preserve jars and looked at them for a moment. Then he said, nearly to himself, "He knew you were coming." Elena didn't answer, but she rubbed her thumb against the wedding band. The hallway from the kitchen led to the bedrooms. There were 2. The smaller was a simple guest room, single wooden bed, indigo wool blanket, a window, a bookshelf. The larger was the master bedroom, and when Elena opened the door and walked in, she stood in the center of the room for a considerable time. The bed was a double, made up with a white sheet, well pulled, as if someone had made it recently. And in fact, someone had. Elena would discover later that there was a caretaker, Benedict, who had received instructions to keep the house ready to be inhabited at any moment. There were 2 pillows. On both sides of the bed, identical nightstands. The one on the left, which Elena recognized as George's side in every hotel room and house where they had slept together for 46 years, had a lamp. The one on the right had a lamp too, and on the nightstand a photograph in a simple wood frame. Elena approached and looked at the photo. It was the same as the one from George's drawer in the city apartment. Her, young, on a beach she still didn't remember, laughing towards someone outside the frame. But in this copy the photo was larger, and the frame was here waiting. It was on her side. In this wooden house in the middle of a forest no one knew, on her side. It was Roger who heard it first. The sound of footsteps outside on the path leading to the door. Not hurried steps, the steps of someone who knows the terrain and moves at his own pace. Roger went to the living room window and looked. Then he went to the door and opened it. On the other side stood a man of about 60 with a straw hat, heavy canvas trousers, and rubber boots up to the knee, carrying a bucket in each hand. He stopped when he saw Roger at the door. Then he looked past Roger toward Elena, who was standing in the living room. "Are you Ms. Elena?" he asked. "I'm Elena," she said. He set both buckets on the ground, and one with tools, one with fruit from the orchard, and removed his hat with a gesture that was genuine, not performative. The gesture of someone raised in an era when you removed your hat for certain people, and who had kept the habit because he believed in it. "My name is Benedict Alvarado Cordero," he said. "I worked with your husband for 30 years. He told me that when you arrived, I should tell you he'd been waiting a long time for this." Benedict Alvarado Cordero was 63 years old and lived 2 kilometers away in a small house in a clearing in the forest that had been the base of operations for George's work since the mid-1990s. He was a native of the region, the son of a woodsman and a farmer with knowledge of the local species, the kind of knowledge that doesn't come from books, but from decades of presence. Knowing that a particular vine blooms in August, that a certain wild orchid only appears above 1,000 feet, with that specific humidity, that when the wood thrush sings 3 times in a row, it will rain before the afternoon is over. George had found him in 1992, when Benedict was a guide for a Forest Service expedition, and George had been impressed not just by his knowledge, but by his ethics. Benedict never extracted anything he shouldn't, never left fire, never cut what didn't need cutting. This man truly respects the forest. George had written in a field report that Roger would find later. Benedict had been George's arm in the construction, hauling lumber, mixing concrete for the foundation pillars, installing the roof tiles, laying the kitchen stones. He had been paid fairly for everything. George had been meticulous about that, Benedict confirmed, and had received, beyond pay, the complete trust of a man he considered the most honest employer he had ever had. "He asked one thing of me," said Benedict, seated at the table in the living room while Elena and Roger sat across from him. "He asked me to maintain the house. I came here once a week for 30 years, swept, oiled, checked the systems, gathered from the orchard so things wouldn't rot on the tree. There was always a fund for it. He left a specific fund with the notary to cover maintenance expenses for 20 years after his death." Elena looked at him. "He planned this 20 years before he died," she said. "He planned it from the beginning," said Benedict. "I don't know when the beginning was, but the first time he told me his plan, which was to build a house where you could live after he was gone, he must have been about 50 years old." He paused. "He said he'd seen that the family was going to keep the concrete, and that the concrete was the least of what he had, that what he truly had was here." In this revelation was the confirmation that George at 50 already knew with sufficient clarity what his sons would do, and had planned 20 years in advance for that day. Something Elena didn't quite know how to process. It wasn't surprise. It was more like recognition, the confirmation of something she had felt but never formulated, that George watched her with a care that went beyond the day-to-day and the declared love, that he saw long-term, that he saw her future with the same patience and precision with which he saw the future of a replanted forest. Benedict left after an hour, leaving the buckets, the orchard fruit for the pantry, the tools in case they were needed, and saying he would be back the following week, and that if Ms. Elena needed anything before then, his number was on a paper in the kitchen drawer beneath the jars. Before leaving, he stood in the doorway for a moment. "You're George," he said. "Talked about you every time he came here. Sometimes we'd spend hours working on the construction, and he'd talk about things from the beginning of your time together, about when you lived in the city, about how much you loved the library." He paused. "I never saw any man speak of a woman that way, as if she were the most important thing he'd ever done, being at your side." After Benedict left, Elena stood alone in the living room while Roger went outside to check the solar panels. She stood in the center of the room, facing the shelf with the books and the photo albums, with the forest light coming through the shutters and casting oblique stripes across the cedar floor. She took off her backpack, opened the outer pocket, took out the envelope, the smaller one, the one George had left in the drawer with the note. Open it only when you're there. She was there. She sat at the table, opened the envelope carefully, folding the flap without tearing it because she wanted to keep it. Inside were folded sheets. Many sheets, she noticed as she unfolded them, written in George's small handwriting with a blue pen that had slipped slightly in places, like someone writing on an uneven surface. At the top of the first page, no date, no formal greeting, just Elena, she began to read. Elena is sitting somewhere in this house right now, perhaps at the living room table, perhaps in the bedroom. I hope it's the living room table, because from the living room table you can see the north window, and the north window has a walnut tree outside with a wild orchid that blooms in October. I don't know if it will be October when you arrive, but if it is, it will be blooming, and I wanted you to see it. I'm going to start from the beginning, because you deserve the complete beginning. In 1995, I took a field trip to this region to catalogue a species of bromeliad for the service. It was March, it had rained all week, and I was in a rental truck on the state highway when I had a flat tire. I got out, changed the tire, and while standing there looking at the shoulder, I noticed there was a trail entering the forest that wasn't on any of my maps. I have a flaw, you know it. I can't leave a trail without following it. I went in. 20 minutes later, I found this clearing. Elena, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of entering a place and feeling that place was waiting for you. I never had it before that day. It's a sensation without an adequate name. It isn't déjà vu, it isn't intuition. It's more like recognition, as if you'd seen the place before in a dream you don't remember, but your body does. I stood in the clearing for about 20 minutes, doing nothing, just looking, just feeling. That day I decided I was going to build something here. It wasn't a grand decision. It was a quiet decision, like all the decisions I've made in life that were truly worth anything. You know what I'm talking about, you're the same way. The biggest decisions I make in silence without telling anyone, and I only discover they were right after I've passed the point of turning back. I bought the land in November of '95, 30 acres, a protected natural area due to its native cover. The price was very low because nobody wanted land you couldn't subdivide. I paid cash. It was savings I'd been setting aside for years in that way of saving where you don't quite know why, but instinct says, don't spend it. I registered the deed in the county land records. I didn't tell you because at that point I still didn't know exactly what I was going to do. And afterward, when I began understanding what I wanted to do, I decided I wanted it to be a surprise. I know you spent your whole life suspecting I kept secrets. I did keep them, but it was never anything that hurt you. It was always this. I was building here. The construction took 25 years because I built when I could, how I could, every time I came to the mountains. I learned carpentry out of necessity and became good at it out of stubbornness. The walls took 4 years, the roof 2, the kitchen 3. The study was the last. I finished it in 2018, 2 years before I died, though at that point I still didn't know I was going to die in 2020, but I knew I was getting older and that what I needed to build here was already built. Why didn't I tell you? I tried a few times, but every time I got close to starting, something stopped me. The main thing was this. I knew the boys were going to try to claim it. If you knew about the house, they would too, and I couldn't trust that they would leave it alone. So I decided it was better for you to discover it after I was gone, when the battle of the documents was already decided, when they'd already settled for the apartment and the investments and couldn't go back. Now I need to tell you about the forest. In the 25 years I worked this land, I catalogued species, and it's what I do, and what I found here went beyond what I expected when I bought the property. There are 12 native species in a condition of vulnerability or threat, according to the current federal endangered species list. The yellow lady's slipper orchid, 3 species of native bromeliad that appear only at this elevation, and with this specific humidity, 2 endemic orchids. The Appalachian running cedar, which was declared locally extinct in 1982, and which I rediscovered here in 2006, and documented, but didn't publish yet, because I wanted to protect the land first. And 5 more. The assessments are in the blue folder in the study, all with photographic records and GPS coordinates. This, Elena, makes the land eligible for the Federal Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. The current value, according to the last table I reviewed in 2019, is $55,000 per year, indexed to inflation for an indefinite time while the program exists. In the blue folder is the contact for Dr. Martha Saito at NYU. She knows about this land. She was the only person I ever showed it to. She wants to use it as a field research station for the graduate ecology program. She presented a formal proposal of $27,000 a year in usage rent with a 10-year renewable contract, the university responsible for maintenance, and you free to continue living here without any restriction. The proposal is in the study drawer, signed by her. And there are carbon credits. In the last 15 years, I worked alongside Benedict on the active reforestation of 22 of the 30 acres, which were previously degraded pasture from the original owners. We planted white oaks, tulip poplars, American chestnuts, red maples and other native species at the appropriate density for sustainable management. The forest you saw coming here is not just old-growth forest. It's a mix of protected primary forest and reforestation I planted myself, tree by tree. There is a carbon credit certification company called Green Carbon Solutions, based in Richmond, Virginia, with whom I spoke in 2019. They did a preliminary technical evaluation, the document is in the folder, and they estimated the carbon stock value of the land at $1.1 million in credits, negotiable on the voluntary market with sustainable management over 30 years. $1.1 million in woodland the boys didn't even want to go see. I know you'll ask why I didn't put this in the will in plain terms, explaining the real value. The answer is because the will becomes public after probate. If I had stated the real value of the forest in the will, the boys would have contested it. They would have tried to argue you weren't capable of managing it. They would have invented some legal theory. Edward is a lawyer. I know him. So I kept the will simple, woodland with no apparent value, and left the real value here where only you would arrive. Elena, I need to tell you one more thing, and I'm going to try to say it plainly, because I was always better with wood than with words. I married you in March of '73, and you were the best thing that ever happened to me. I don't say it the way people say it in a letter. I say it the way a person says it, after 50 years of looking at the same data and checking the calculation again. And the calculation always comes out the same. You were the best. You were more than I deserved and much better than I knew how to tell you while I was alive. I built this house thinking about you every single time. The windows face east because you always loved mornings. The bed is on your side because the right side was always yours. The shelf has the books you'll want to read. I spent the last 2 years listing the ones I knew you hadn't yet discovered and had them ordered. The garden has the herbs you use: basil, parsley, rosemary, lemon verbena. The orchard has orange, lemon, apple and pawpaw, because you always said the pawpaw was the most beautiful fruit that existed, and it was a crime that nobody planted them anymore. You were never forgotten, Elena. You were never left behind. You were protected. They kept the concrete, you kept the forest, and the forest always mattered more. With all the love a whole life can hold. George. P.S. The orchid by the north window needs water once a week, a little water, and it doesn't like direct sun. You'll know how to take care of it. You always knew how to take care of everything. Elena reread the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, held the envelope in both hands as if it was something that could break, and sat looking at the north window. The orchid was there. It wasn't October. It was September, 1 week before October. But the buds were already formed, small and firm, on the verge of opening. She cried. She cried the way someone releases something that has been held for too long, with the whole body participating, shoulders dropping, chin falling to her chest, hands still gripping the envelope. It was not the crying of despair she had cried in the city apartment the night of the phone call. It was a different cry, of a completely different quality. The cry of when something that hurt for a long time finally makes sense, of when the story that seemed to have ended badly reveals the paragraph that was missing. Roger came back from outside and stopped in the doorway when he saw. He said nothing. He went to sit in the farthest chair and stayed quiet, looking at his own hands, giving her the space she needed, with the discreet emotional intelligence of someone who has learned to respect another person's grief. When the crying passed, not ended, but passed, moved into a lower frequency that allowed breathing, Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at Roger. "He knew everything," she said. "He always knew everything," said Roger. "That was George." Elena looked at the north window for a moment. "The boys," she said with a voice that had more curiosity in it than bitterness, "kept an apartment in the city and the investments, which are theirs to spend as they please, legitimately, in the will, without contest from me." She paused. "And I kept $400,000 a year from the conservation program, $27,000 annually from the university, and $1.1 million in carbon credits on land George planted for 25 years. She looked at Roger. "And a house of 1,900 square feet with 3,000 books he bought thinking of me." Roger looked at her. "That's right," he said simply. Elena rubbed her thumb against the wedding band. "They said it was forest," she said, "that it didn't even have access." "It has access," said Roger. 20 minutes of trail." 20 minutes of trail, repeated Elena. And for the first time in months, perhaps in years, perhaps since that August morning of 2016 with the coffee on the stoop, she smiled. In the first 15 days, Elena did nothing. She made no decisions, called no lawyers, wrote no emails, reviewed no documents. She woke when she woke. She made coffee with the rainwater heated on George's stove. She sat at the table with one of the books from the shelf and stayed reading, while the forest light changed throughout the day, cooler in the morning, golden at the end of the afternoon, when the sun managed to break through the oak canopy at the correct angle. It was, she realized later, the first time in 50 years that there was nothing she needed to do for someone else before she could care for herself. No children waiting for breakfast, no schedule to manage, no laundry to finish before morning. Only her, the forest, George's books, and the silence, which was not an absence of sound. There were birds, there was wind in the canopy, there was rain when it rained, there was the stream she discovered in the second week, 200 yards behind the house, running over smooth stones with that sound of water that isn't compressed. It was a silence of mental overload, of obligation, of constant vigilance. And without that overload, Elena discovered there were spaces inside her she had never known. Benedict appeared on Tuesdays and Thursdays, as he always had. He brought fruit from the orchard, made whatever repairs needed making, and talked. He told more stories of George, how the first construction winter had been with rain every day, and the lumber slow to dry, how they had put the roof on one weekend in May of 2002, just the two of them, and celebrated with a whiskey Benedict brought from his house. How George would sometimes come alone during the week, and Benedict would arrive in the morning to find the table covered in carpentry sketches George had made the night before by the light of a gas lamp, because the solar system wasn't installed until 2012. Benedict had a wife, Ms. Nilda, who came on the fourth day with a pot of black beans with smoked pork and bay leaf, the kind of dish the Virginia mountain people had made their own for generations, which Elena ate in 2 portions and was saddened when it ran out. Ms. Nilda had the constitution of someone who had worked in the country all her life, compact, with strong arms and a direct way of speaking without hedging, which Elena recognized immediately as the same manner as her own mother, Eunice, and which made something inside her loosen that had not loosened since she left the city. "Are you staying?" asked Miss Nilda, sitting at the kitchen table while Elena washed the empty pot. "I'm staying," said Elena. "Good," said Ms. Nilda, as if it were the most obvious decision in the world. "This house has been waiting for you far too long." On day 20, Elena opened the blue folder. She sat at the table with the folder in front of her and went through document by document, reading carefully without hurry. There were the technical assessments of the catalogued species, 12 separate documents, each with photos, GPS coordinates, observation history, federal listings, bibliographical references. There was the topographic survey of the land done in 2018, with full mapping in contour lines. There was Dr. Martha Saito's proposal, 5 pages, signed with the institutional seal of NYU, proposing the research station contract in the terms George had described in the letter. There was the Green Carbon Solutions technical evaluation, 12 pages with methodology, calculations, projections, and on the last page, the figure, down to $140,000 in carbon credits at 2019 market values. And at the bottom of the folder, a different envelope, not folded paper but a formal correspondence envelope with the address of a law firm in Richmond, Virginia. Attorney Camila Fuentes, bar number 132-4796. Elena opened it. It was a cover letter from an environmental attorney George had retained in 2018 to oversee the entire process of registering the carbon credits and activating the Federal Conservation Payment Program. The letter stated that the documentation was complete, the process pre-filed, and that as soon as the property owner identified in the process, Elena Kristina Resende Bacevich, presented herself at the office with the deed and the death certificate, she would initiate both processes with an estimated approval timeline of 90 days. George had pre-filed the processes. There was an attorney waiting for her. Elena stared at the letter for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. There was weak but sufficient signal at the study window, which George had also planned for. She dialed the number for attorney Camila Fuentes. The attorney answered on the second ring, and when Elena said her name, there was a brief pause on the other end of the line. And then attorney Camila said, "Ms. Elena, your husband told me you were going to call. I've been waiting. When can you come to Richmond?" The weeks that followed were of constant movement in the direction of a future Elena was learning to imagine. Attorney Camila Fuentes was an efficient woman of 51, with the calm of someone who has been efficient long enough not to need to try. Her office in Richmond's historic district had plants everywhere, and a secretary named Grace who made strong coffee and attended to each client as if they were the only one that day. Elena went to Richmond twice in October by bus, not by cab, because she discovered the Staunton-Richmond line left at 6:30 in the morning and arrived at 8:30 and allowed her to return the same day. And each time she arrived at the office, there were more pieces fitting into the puzzle George had left pre-assembled. The application for the conservation program was filed on October 23rd. The university proposal was formally accepted in November, with the contract signing scheduled for January of the following year. Dr. Martha Saito appeared in person with 2 researchers to do a preliminary survey of the land and spent 2 hours walking the forest with Benedict, then came back with the eyes of someone who had just found exactly what they were looking for. "Ms. Elena," she said before leaving, "this is the best preserved research site I have visited in the Appalachian region. Your husband was an extraordinary scientist." And it was during Martha's visit that the second letter appeared. Martha had asked to see George's study. She wanted to check if there were field notebooks not included in the formal assessments, because researchers sometimes kept observations in their notebooks that hadn't made it into official documents. Elena took her to the study, in the L-shaped wing of the house, accessible through a door off the hallway that had been closed but not locked. It was a smaller room than the bedrooms, but sufficient for a large desk, shelves on 3 available walls, and an east-facing window that received the first light of the day. On George's work desk were the field notebooks, 22 spiral-bound numbered notebooks with leather covers spanning 1995 to 2019. There was a laptop with a charger, measuring instruments, a field GPS, and beneath all of that, in a drawer Elena hadn't yet opened because it was stuck and required a firm push to give way, a second envelope, smaller than the first, with only her name written on the front, Elena, in the same small blue ink handwriting. Elena opened it that night after Martha and the researchers had left. She sat at George's desk with the late afternoon light coming through the east window, low now, golden, nearly end of day, and unfolded the pages. It was shorter than the first letter, a single page, dated at the top, August 2019, 15 months before George's death. Elena, I found this drawer stuck while reorganizing the study this afternoon and thought, it's the right place. You'll need a screwdriver to open it, which means it will take you a while to find it, but you are patient, and everything that matters takes a little time. One last thing I didn't put in the first letter, because at that point I was still verifying. There is a stream on this land. Have you found it yet? Yes, you've explored a bit. That stream is a natural mineral spring. I had the water analyzed in 2018, and the assessment is in the same blue folder, in the last section which you may not have reached yet. The water has the same mineral composition as the springs in this part of the valley that supply the local bottlers. I spoke informally with a businessman in that sector. I didn't close anything because it wasn't my decision to close, but there is market interest in licensing the spring for small batch bottling. Informal estimate, $12,000 to $16,000 a year in licensing royalties. Attorney Camilla has the businessman's contact. I don't know if you'll want to do that. You might prefer to leave the stream as a stream. That would also be the right decision. You'll know better than I do. What I know is that I left what I could, and more than was needed perhaps, but I couldn't stop planting. It's a disease. You always said so. You were right. Take good care of the orchid. J. 3 months after Elena arrived at the property, Edward called. She was on the front porch with a cup of coffee and one of George's field notebooks open in her lap. She had been reading them in order, slowly, as if they were a diary. He never called a diary, but which was one, because there were observations that were not only scientific. The wood thrush appeared 3 days in a row. When that happens, I remember there are things no one can measure. And yes, it rained so much the stream overflowed and covered the stones. I thought of Elena and her patience, which is like the rain. It doesn't stop. Edward's number appeared on the screen. Elena watched it ring twice. She answered. Mom. Edward's voice had the tone he used when he wanted to appear reasonable, the tone Elena had recognized since he was 15 and wanted to negotiate his curfew. How are you? We've been trying to reach you for weeks. I'm fine, said Elena. I had no signal. Brief pause. You're on the land. I am. Another pause, this one of strategic adjustment. She felt it. We found out some things about the land Dad had, that there was more to it than it seemed. We'd like to talk. How long have you known? A few weeks, said Edward, with too much care to be spontaneous. Marcus has a contact in the environmental sector who mentioned the property name in a filing. I understand, said Elena. We didn't know, he said. If we had known, the division would have been different. We wouldn't have left you with... Edward, said Elena in that oak tree voice of hers, quiet, unhurried, as final as something that had grown slowly for decades. I'm going to say this once. Silence on the other end. Your father left exactly what he intended for each person. You kept the apartment and the investments, legitimate, titled with no contest from me. I kept the land, legitimate, titled with no contest from you, because you signed every document when you said it was worthless forest. A pause. It wasn't worthless forest. It was what your father spent his entire life building for me. And he explained very clearly in the letter why he didn't say so before. Mum, Edward started. Let me finish, said Elena, still in that voice, without anger, without bitterness, with the serenity of someone who stands on the right side of a calculation already verified. I'm not contesting the will. I'm not asking for review. I don't need to. I have what I need. But I'm also not dividing anything here with you, because there is nothing to divide. Everything here belongs to me, was planned to belong to me, and is properly documented and registered. Attorney Camilla Fuentes has the complete documentation. Another pause. If you want to maintain contact as sons, the door is open. If you want to maintain contact as unhappy heirs, you'll need a different attorney than me, Edward, because a case between a son and his mother is something most judges look on with very little sympathy, and you know that better than I do. A long silence. You kept the concrete, said Elena with the same serenity. I kept the forest, and the forest is worth more. That isn't bitterness, it's simply what happened. Edward didn't respond immediately. When he spoke, his voice had shifted to something closer to real, without the negotiating tone, without the rehearsed efficiency. It was almost just Edward, 49 years old, Elena's son, calling a mother who had been clear about the terms. "Mom, we were wrong." "You were," confirmed Elena. "We can talk about that separately from the matter of the land." "Whenever you're ready," said Elena. "But come here, 20 minutes of trail from the state highway. Benedict will show you the way." She paused. "It's a beautiful place. Your father built it with care. You should see it." She hung up, set the phone on the porch table, picked up the coffee cup and looked at the oak trees. She felt peace. Not the peace of someone who won something, the peace of someone who is exactly where they need to be, doing exactly what they need to do, with no more debts to the past and no fear of what is coming. The orchid by the north window had opened. It was October. In April of the following year, 6 months after Elena's arrival on the land, the forest was different. Not the forest of the property, which remained the same as itself, with the imperturbability of very old things. But the forest of Elena's life had changed with the same logic as a well-managed reforestation, slowly, in parts, in a way whose full magnitude is only perceived when one stops and looks back. The conservation program approval had come through in February, 93 days after the application, within Attorney Camilla's estimate. The first deposit of $55,000 arrived in Elena's account on the 28th of February, which she discovered one Saturday morning in the kitchen, making coffee, when the bank notification came through on her phone, and she stood with the kettle in her hand for an unnecessarily long time before pouring the water in the cup. The university contract was signed on January 15th. Martha Saito came in person with 3 professors from the department, bringing a bottle of sparkling wine made from local grapes, and saying it was to celebrate the most beautiful scientific partnership the department would make that year. Elena opened it and poured into plain glass tumblers, the elegant ones George had bought for the occasion, and they toasted on the front porch, with the oak trees as backdrop and the birds providing a soundtrack no one had arranged, but that was perfect. The university team installed on the eastern section of the land a weather station and 2 permanent species monitoring transects, discrete brushed aluminum structures nearly invisible in the forest. 2 doctoral researchers now spent 2 weeks per month on the land, sleeping in the guest room, heading out early with equipment in their packs and returning at the end of the afternoon with field notebooks full of observations. They were young, one named Felipe, 28, with the seriousness of someone who wants to be the next George Bachovich, and one named Isabel, 26, who knew the scientific name of every wild orchid on the property from memory, and who, in the first week, had found in the northeast section a specimen of the Appalachian running cedar in bloom, the species George had documented as rediscovered but not published, and reacted with such scientific enthusiasm that Benedict stood 30 feet away, watching with that expression of quiet satisfaction. The look of someone who sees a story arrive where it needed to arrive. Elena was fond of the researchers, with the ease one feels toward people who are exactly in the right place, doing exactly the right thing. Felipe asked questions about George at every opportunity, and Elena answered gladly. There was something restorative about speaking of George to people who understood what he had done in a way his own sons never had. Isabel, for her part, had the habit of arriving at the porch at the end of the day with a pawpaw from the orchard and saying, "Good evening, Miss Elena," with the formality of someone raised with good manners, and that simple habit, the greeting, the pawpaw, the end of the day, had become one of the things Elena waited for, with a specific pleasure that took time to identify as the pleasure of belonging to a shared routine. Her own routine had formed with the naturalness of things that aren't forced. She woke at 6. Her body had regulated itself without an alarm, responding to the light that came through the east window of the bedroom when the sun began to touch the highest canopy. She lay for a moment, listening to the early birds yield their turn to the morning birds. Distinct populations, with different schedules, she had learned from Felipe. And there was something in the transition between the 2 shifts that she had begun to consider the most beautiful moment of the day. Then coffee. The coffee ritual had become elaborate in the quiet way that rituals do when there is time. Water heated to the right temperature. Coffee ground in the moment on a hand grinder she found in a kitchen cabinet, a gift from George, she knew, because he knew she liked fresh coffee brewed in a cloth filter that Miss Nilda had brought, saying paper filters were for people without patience. Elena took her coffee on the porch standing at first, Then she discovered there was a walnut rocking chair stored in the guest room, made by George, which fit perfectly in the right corner of the porch where the morning sun arrived first, and she began taking coffee seated in the rocker with the book of the day in her lap. She read a great deal. The shelf had 3,000 volumes, as the letter had said, and Elena was doing what she had never had time to do in the city, reading in order, slowly, with a pen to underline, and a small notebook to record things she wanted to remember or think about later. She had discovered that she loved botany. George's technical books, which before would have seemed dry, were, when read in that place, profoundly moving. Scientific language describing things she could see through the window, naming what was right in front of her as an act of love toward the visible. She had also discovered she loved poetry, with an intensity she hadn't had before, perhaps because poetry requires silence to work, and silence had been what was most lacking in the previous 50 years. At 10, the garden. The kitchen garden George had planted was, in the first months, in a state of gentle neglect. The herbs had overgrown. The vegetable beds needed reorganizing. The orchard needed pruning. Elena began slowly with gloves Benedict lent her, and discovered there was a satisfaction in working with the earth that she couldn't compare with anything else. It was physical without being exhausting, immediate without being rushed, and there was a concrete and beautiful return. The seedling you planted last week already has 2 more inches. The lettuce is ready to harvest. The pawpaw you watered yesterday has more color today. Sometimes Benedict worked alongside her, and they talked, not about anything in particular, the way people who understand each other well talk, jumping between topics without needing transitions, returning to earlier subjects without warning. Benedict was teaching her to identify the native species, those original to the land, those he had helped George plant, the differences between them, that only someone who knows them closely can see. It was a class that happened without calling itself a class, which is the only kind of class that truly stays. Ms. Nilda came on Fridays with an excess of food, always more than Elena could eat, always so good it was impossible to decline, and stayed for an hour talking at the kitchen table with the kind of conversation between mature women that covers everything with efficiency. Family, local politics, medicinal plants, controlled gossip, observations about the character of people they knew that would be devastating if said with malice, but said with the plain factual precision of someone who simply takes note, had an almost philosophical quality. Elena had spent decades going to quilting groups and never had that kind of conversation. In the city, there was always a layer of social polish filtering out the substance. Here there was no filter, and that, she was discovering, was much better. There were also, with growing frequency, the research gatherings. Martha Saito organized from March onward monthly meetings on the land, sometimes just herself and the 2 doctoral students, sometimes with visiting professors from other institutions. Elena didn't participate in the technical portions, but was invariably present at the beginning and end, serving coffee and listening to what she understood, and letting pass what she didn't, without embarrassment. And it was at one of those gatherings on a Saturday in April that Martha said, "Ms. Helena, we're thinking about naming the endemic orchid species we confirmed as a new species on this land. We need an epithet, a scientific surname. We wanted to ask your permission to use Bachovich." Elena looked at her. "Both of them?" she asked. "Bachovich was George's name, but it was also my married name." Martha smiled. "Exactly. Both of them." She paused. "Epidendrum Bachovichti, in honor of the couple who cared for this forest for 30 years. Elena rubbed her thumb against the wedding band. "You can use it," she said. "Edward and Marcus. They came in May, not together, but separately, 2 weeks apart. Edward first, alone without Fernanda one Thursday afternoon when he called in the morning, asking if he could come, and Elena said yes, and gave him the directions to the trail access point. Benedict met him and brought him to the house, and when Edward appeared in the clearing, 49 years old, his city clothes exchanged for canvas trousers and a polo shirt, his city shoes completely inadequate for the trail, but that was his choice, Elena watched him stop in front of the house with an expression she hadn't seen on her son in decades. Genuine surprise, without filter, without the lawyer's armor. He stood looking at the house for a long time without saying anything, Then he said, "My God." "Come in," said Elena. They spent 3 hours together. Edward walked through every room, touched the walls, ran his hand along the wood with the gesture of someone trying to understand with touch what the eyes couldn't fully process. He stood a long time in front of the bookshelf, opened one of the photo albums, and stood with it for about 10 minutes, turning the pages slowly. At some point, with the voice of Edward the child rather than Edward the attorney, he said, "He did this for 25 years and didn't tell anyone." "He told me," said Elena, "in the letter." Edward looked at her. "Mom, I need to ask your forgiveness for a lot of things." "I know," said Elena. "It's not enough," he said. "It isn't," she agreed. "But it's a beginning." They had coffee on the porch. Edward talked, really talked without strategy, the way he spoke when he was 12 before learning that the world rewarded negotiation more than honesty. He said he'd spent his life treating his mother as a given, as part of the furniture, as someone who would always be there without needing anything, because she had never asked for anything. He said he'd thought his father was the one with value in the family and his mother was the support structure. And now he was sitting in this house built over 25 years of silent love and feeling, for the first time, physically and not abstractly, how wrong he had been. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You weren't bad. You were careless. And carelessness can be corrected if one wants to." Edward looked toward the orchard and then mentioned his sons, 8 and 6 years old, who were still Elena's grandchildren, but who didn't visit her. "I'd like to bring the boys," he said, "if you'll have them." "I'll have them," said Eleanor. 20 minutes of trail is exactly what a child needs. Marcus came 2 weeks later with Patricia and their children, the 12 and 9-year-old who Elena barely knew, but who arrived at the clearing with the eyes of children who had never been in real forest, and immediately ran toward the stream when Benedict mentioned there was one. Patricia stood in the center of the living room for a long moment, with an expression Elena recognized as someone being forced to revise an opinion they had formed long ago about another person. She said nothing, but when she left in the late afternoon, she said thank you with a simplicity Elena accepted without making more of it than was warranted. Marcus was harder. His indifference was deeper than Edward's excess, and conversations with him always had an irregular rhythm, parts where he spoke honestly, parts where he fell back into the economy of words. But there was one thing he said before leaving that Eleanor kept. "Mom, I always knew you were stronger than we let you be. But seeing this here..." He nodded toward the house, the forest, the whole land. "It's something else. It's a lot, Mom. It's a lot that he did for you." "Yes," said Elena, "and I'm going to be worthy of it." What Elena's forest became after a year is something that anyone who had seen the sealed envelope from the manila folder in September and then saw the land in September the following year would have difficulty believing was the same story. The house was identical in structure. George had built it to last for centuries, and what Benedict had maintained for 30 years continued to be maintained with the resources now available. But it was different in the way a house becomes different when someone truly lives in it. There were books open on the living room table, a forgotten cup on the windowsill, new garden beds in the kitchen garden that Elena had planned and planted herself. There were branches in the orchard pruned the right way, and fruits ripening at their natural pace, unrushed. On the porch, the walnut rocker with a cloth cushion Miss Nilda had made as a gift. In the kitchen cabinet, new jars with labels in Elena's handwriting, basil March, peppers April, wild pawpaw June. At the research station, Felipe had completed the full land mapping, and the paper on the Appalachian running cedar was under review at an international scientific journal, with George credited as the original discoverer of the species and Elena credited as guardian of the habitat, which Martha had insisted on with the firmness of someone who will not accept a counter-argument. Isabel had defended the first chapter of her dissertation using data exclusively from the land, and in the presentation had thanked Ms. Elena Bachovich, who cared for this forest before she knew she was caring for it. The carbon credit certification process was in an advanced stage. Attorney Camilla estimated approval for the end of the year, with the first negotiable credits in the first quarter of the following year. Green Carbon Solutions had revised the evaluation upward. With the more precise mapping and the documentation of rare species, the value had increased to $1.35 million. The spring stream, Elena had decided it would remain a stream. Not for economic reasons, the businessman in Richmond was legitimate and the proposal was fair. But she had been sitting on a stone in the stream one June afternoon, with her feet in the water and George's field notebooks in her lap, and had reread the note he had written in 2002. The stream this afternoon had the sound of a Saturday morning. I don't know how to explain it better. And she had understood that there are things that are worth more as they are than as what they could become, and that was perhaps the main lesson of everything she had lived. Ms. Nilda had become the most constant presence in Elena's life, not as an employee, not as a favor, but as neighbor and friend, with the firmness that friendship between mature women acquires when there is no longer energy for unnecessary politeness and only what is real remains. They went together to the Staunton Farmers Market on Fridays. They had coffee at Nilda's house on Wednesday mornings. And sometimes Elena slept at the couple's house when there was heavy rain and the trail was difficult. And in those nights there was a quality of belonging that she had not felt in any city house in 50 years. There were also, from July onward, the children. Elena's grandchildren from Edward came once a month, sometimes twice. The trail had become for both boys the best place in the world, which is what most children raised in apartments feel at their first contact with real forest. The 8-year-old had on one August visit spent 2 hours standing still, watching a spider build its web between two trunks, which Felipe had taken as a promising sign of scientific vocation, and given him an illustrated guide to North American spiders with a personal inscription. The boy had reread it 3 times in the same week, according to Edward. It was a September morning, almost exactly 1 year after the morning Elena had first entered the trail with Roger, and she was in the porch rocker with her coffee and George's 2014 field notebook, when a small thing happened that stayed with her. The orchid by the north window was blooming again. The buds that had opened in October the previous year had given way to full flowers in October and dried in December. In March, new stems had begun to appear, and now the stems had buds, and tomorrow or the day after some of them would open. Elena looked at the buds, looked at her fingers around the coffee cup, looked at the wedding band on the correct finger where it had been for 52 years. She opened George's 2014 field notebook to the marked page, an October entry during one of his last visits to the land before finishing the study. The North Orchid bloomed again. It blooms every October for 20 years. Such constancy, such faithfulness. There are things that need no more reason than to continue. Elena reread the last sentence. There are things that need no more reason than to continue. She sat with the notebook open in her lap and looked at the forest, the old oaks with their straight trunks and circular canopies, which had taken 80 years to reach that height. The understory of walnut and cedar that George had planted one by one over decades, the stream she couldn't hear but knew was there, running over the stones without hurry, with that sound of a Saturday morning. 74 years old. A wedding ring of 52 years, a forest that took 30 years to grow and will take 100 more to finish growing. A house of noble hardwood that will outlast any concrete that ever existed in the city. An orchid that blooms in October with the constancy of one who needed no applause to continue. George had said, "You kept the forest and the forest is worth more." He was right, but not in the way the numbers said it. Not because of the conservation program, not because of the carbon credits, not because of the university. In the way the forest is worth something when you know it from the inside, when you know the name of every species and the month of every bloom, and the specific sound the stream makes in August when the rains lessen, and the water runs low, and the stones appear. Elena Kristina Resende-Bachovich set her coffee cup on the edge of the porch, closed George's notebook with care, looked at the orchid buds and smiled. It was not the smile of someone who had won something. It was the smile of someone who had arrived, and there in the Virginia mountains, among the oak trees her husband had planted one by one, and the forest he had spent his life protecting, and the stream she had decided to leave as a stream, because some things are worth more as they are, the day continued. The birds changed shifts, the light changed angle. The buds moved a little closer to opening, and Elena stayed in the rocker, because it's never too late. And if Elena's story touched your heart, if you believe it's never too late to begin again, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Never too late. Turn on the bell to follow every new story and comment below what time it is where you're watching this. Because every comment helps this story reach someone who needs to hear that it isn't over yet. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their own worth, because together we prove it's never too late.